Dobar dan. That means good day. TalkCast PDX. Find us on the web at talkcastpdx.com. It's July 20th today, 2021. Name of the show is The Bogdanich Perspective. I'm your host, Paul Bogdanich, and welcome. Title of today's show is Two Islands. Get into that in a minute. Last week, I talked about Paul Pelosi, the husband of Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, and how he was making trades that would be illegal under the insider trading laws for us, but that he did them again. And I mentioned what I said during last week's episode, and I quote, I said, there's a site, Blue Whale or something like that, who went through all his trades and logged them and everything else, unquote. And I am informed that when what I did was called a shout out, and that when I do something like that, I am to clearly attribute the site involved. So the site involved is a site called Unusual Whales, UNUSUAL, Unusual Whales, WHALES. Whales in this context means large one-sided trades. So that if you look at this site, you can see what large investors are doing when they make large one-sided trades. He tracks them all. But he has a directory in there where he tracks the trades of people in Congress, the Senate and the House. And that's where this Paul Pelosi data showed up. But if you want to check on your congressman's trading habits, it's unusualwhales.com. Reading the news for content. Last week I talked about a concept called falsifiability, or what's falsifiable, and if it's not falsifiable, it belongs in the realm of philosophy. And I would say most of the articles that I read belong in the realm of philosophy, as opposed to news items. A couple of them were specious. Specious is a word that means superficially plausible, but actually wrong, or misguided. Wrong is a little bit strong word, but specious. You know, it sounds good, but you think about it, it's not going to work, that kind of thing. And I ran into an example of that, and it kind of concerns me, so I want to talk about it a little bit. And it's this idea that we should become involved in, liberate, or otherwise directly intervene in Cuba. There's good support for that in the Cuban-American community in the United States, and you kind of have to understand the significance of that and the history. So I'm going to go through it just a little bit. I'm going to be reading my notes a lot because I'm not an expert in this particular field, and I have to get my dates straight. But if you compare Cuba and Taiwan, okay, they're very close corollaries, as I hope you'll see. Physical characteristics. Cuba is 650 miles long by 65 miles wide, about 42,000 square miles, has a population of 12 million people. It's 150 miles from the mainland of the United States, with the mainland being Everglades Park in the southern tip of Florida. In the press, you'll often hear that it's only 90 miles from the U.S., and that's true if you measure it from an island called Key West, which is technically part of the state of Florida. So if you go to Key West, which is in, I guess, the Gulf of Mexico, I don't think it's the Caribbean, but down there and measure, it's only 90 miles. But it's 230 miles to the nearest major port, okay? And if you look at Taiwan, Taiwan's 235 miles long, 75 miles wide, 14,000 square miles, has twice as many people. It's a little smaller, about a third the size, but it has 2 times as many people, 24 million. It's 110 miles from the Chinese mainland. It's only 120 miles from the nearest major port, and there are 2 major ports within 150 miles. If you go to one of their islands that's about the size of Key West and measure from there, it's 80 miles. But 80 miles, 90 miles, 230 miles to a port for Cuba, and 150 miles to 2 ports. They're roughly similar. And the point that I'm trying to make is, geographically speaking, okay, it's important to remember that both are absolutely indefensible, militarily speaking. Forget the political consequences and all that. Just militarily speaking, they're indefensible. If we got a bug up our bum and for some reason and decided that we wanted to take over Cuba. Nobody could stop us. We're just too close, and anybody that would try and defend the island is just too far away, and it doesn't work. Our supply lines are short, theirs are long, but the same is true of Taiwan. Okay, both in strict military terms, both islands are completely indefensible. I'm going to go through the political history because this is important. Cuba. Talking of Cuba, until the mid-19th century, it was a part of Spanish Hispaniola. Okay, the Spanish took over all of what we call Hispaniola in the early 1600s, and it stayed that way for a long time until the mid-19th century. The first serious revolts, there were revolts from the time the Spanish first landed, but I mean the first serious ones with good chances of success started in 1868 to 1890. Okay, and the Cuban War of Independence, what they call, when they finally got rid of the Spanish, was from 1895 to 1898. At the time, in the United States, William Randolph Hearst owned about half the papers in the United States. And he wanted to cause a war with the Spanish, and he succeeded, by the way. But he used to fabricate stories about Spanish atrocities in Cuba, Spanish atrocities in the Philippines, and so on. And he used to they were completely fabricated. And he used to widely disseminate them and so on. And it was called yellow journalism. Our ownership concentration of media makes the same thing possible today, which I think is why it's important to mention that. In response to this public relations campaign run by the editor of the newspaper, no government official was behind it. But by 1897, President McKinley at the time, and the House Speaker was a guy by the name of Thomas Bennett Reed. They were both very firmly opposed to sending any troops to Cuba. But on March 17, 1898, a Republican senator from Vermont, a guy by the name of Redfield Proctor, gave a speech that Hearst picked up and made sure everybody read it, good commentary on the speech and all that kind of stuff. And it convinced the business and religious elements, but particularly the religious elements in the United States, that it was a good idea to go into Cuba for quote-unquote humanitarian purposes. The political pressure grew on President McKinley, and on April 11th, 1898, McKinley asked for authority to send troops to Cuba for the purpose of ending the Civil War. April 19th, that's a week later, okay, Congress passed a joint resolution. In the House of Representatives, the vote was 311 to 6. Okay, so that shows you the measure of popular support. But it was 42 to 35 in the Senate, much closer, okay? There was a senator another Republican senator from Colorado, a guy by the name of Henry Teller. And in order to get the bill through the Senate or to tighten it up and get some support, he passed what was known as the Teller Amendment. And the Teller Amendment in relevant part reads, "The United States hereby disclaims any disposition of intention to exercise sovereignty, jurisdiction, over or control over said island except for pacification thereof, and asserts its determination, when that is accomplished, to leave the government and control of the island to its people." I'm going to take a bit of a detour here just to compare that to modern times. Think about what I just said. The president asked for an authorization to use troops. Congress got it to a vote within a week. As part of the vote in the Senate, a group of senators clearly delineated, narrowed the scope of, and controlled the war aim. What's the war plan? Why are we doing this? Is it an open-ended war where we're just going to go in there and see what happens like we did in 2001? Or does it have a specific purpose? And this one had a specific purpose. Pacification thereof, and asserts its determination, when that is accomplished, to leave the government and control of the island to its people. So we went in there, May 1898. By August of 1898, that caused what we refer to as the Spanish-American War. Back to Cuba. Spain was driven out. 1890, call it, 1898. They proceeded, to govern themselves until 1933, and then a group of sergeants in the military staged a coup. And the main sergeant in charge was a guy by the name of Batista, Sergeant Batista, and he came to power. He was very corrupt. What he was doing was selling Cuban lands and agriculture and things of that nature to the American mafia and other American business interests. Population wanted to get rid of him. They negotiated a settlement, and the settlement was the Cuban Constitution of 1940. One of the provisions of the Constitution of 1940 is that Batista, the military ruler at the time, would be the first president, and he would be able to serve from 1940 to 1944, and then he would be ineligible for election after that. So in other words, they gave him another 4 years, and then he's gone. And they wrote a constitution. That was in 1944. In 1942, so this is after they passed the Constitution and during Batista's last 4 years, the British Foreign Office sent an urgent telegram to then President Roosevelt describing, quote, endemic corruption exceeding anything that had gone on previously in Cuba. In other words, he was increased the pace of selling Cuban natural resources and assets to principally the American mafia and our business interests. Batista's term ended in 1944, I think it was. Yes, 1944. He went to Miami, took his dough from selling Cuban assets, went to Miami. But in 1952, that's 8 years later, returned to Cuba and overthrew the government. That immediately started resistance, but the resistance kind of simmered in between 1952 and 56. And he made the island of Cuba a base for the American mafia. If you've ever seen the Godfather trilogy, the whole second episode, that part about Cuba, I can't remember the name of the character in the Godfather movie, but the actual man, the mafia don, was a guy by the name of Meyer Lansky. And resistance grew, started a civil war in 1953, but it simmered until 1956. The American government sent tanks and napalm and guns and artillery pieces to the Batista regime, of course. By 1958, it became clear that Batista wasn't going to be able to hold out, so we switched sides and we started sending guns and money and artillery to Castro's side. And on January 1st, 1959, Castro became the de facto ruler of Cuba, a communist government, right? So that's the political history there. Now for Taiwan. Taiwan was originally inhabited by indigenous peoples of South Chinese descent. A bunch of different tribes, very violent towards each other. They were headhunters. They used to take the heads of their enemies. China took control of the island in 1683. The Japanese took control of the island from China in 1895 as part of the First Sino-Japanese War. They used it as a base to operate against China. Japan pacified the population. Those who resisted were treated very harshly. The indigenous women that survived were made comfort women and all the other nice things that the Japanese imperialists did in those days. But they built up a following, amongst the pacified part of the population. They industrialized the island. They educated the people of Taiwan in Japanese culture and so on. And the Taiwanese, this is important to remember from the Chinese point of view, the Taiwanese fought with the Japanese against China in World War II. That's very important to remember. If you're Chinese, you remember that. The Taiwanese fought with the Japanese against China in World War II. As World War II was closing down by the end, 1943, the U.S., British, and Chinese State Departments issued a proclamation called the Cairo Declaration that, quote, demanded the return of Taiwan and associated islands to China. The U.S. and the British supported this proposal because we were convinced that China, after the war, was going to be led by a guy by the name of Chiang Kai-shek, who had the support of the United States and the British. But prior to World War II, remember 2 weeks ago I talked about how they had a big celebration for the 100th year anniversary of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. And that means Chinese Communist Party was founded in 1921 by Mao, Chairman Mao. And they started a low-grade civil war in 1927 in between the Chinese nationalists, who were headed by Chiang Kai-shek, and then the CCP, which is Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong. And that war kind of simmered. When the Second World War happened, they abandoned it. They took a break. They went from fighting each other to fighting the Japanese, right? And then after the Second World War, they picked it up again. And by 1949, the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, had defeated the nationalists, being led by Chiang Kai-shek. And Chiang Kai-shek and over 2 million of his followers, his generals, his colonels, his regional governors, his rich supporters, 2 million Chinese nationalist high officials were moved to Taiwan, okay, by the United States. We provided the transportation. We provided the water and other systems. You can't just put 2 million people on an island with no water and no sewers. They'll die of cholera. We made it possible for the opposition leader and 2 million of his followers to be moved to Taiwan in 1949, May of 1949. First thing Mr. Chiang Kai-shek did in Taiwan was impose martial law over the entire island. The condition of martial law under the nationalists lasted until 1987. It's 38 years. Then after that, they started with some democratic reforms. They had their first presidential election in 1996. And a lot of people think that the only reason that the Chinese didn't take Taiwan in the 1950s or the 60s or the 70s or the 80s or last year was because of the political inconvenience in the modern world and our protection. So if you look at these two islands in some kind of a broader context, what you have, relatively speaking, they're small little independent countries, island countries. They happen to exist right next to two great powers. The political system in Cuba is communist, which is the antithesis of the political system in the great power right next to it. The political system in Taiwan is quasi-democratic, the exact antithesis of the great power next to it. They're twins, except for the shoe is on the other foot. It's my contention that how we treat Cuba forms a precedent for how the Chinese will feel free to treat Taiwan. I would point out that the yellow journalism of William Randolph Hearst and our journalistic situation today are eerily similar. If some senator or group thereof started to push this idea for their own political purposes, the press might pick it up like they did then, change popular opinion. But this wouldn't be the first time that something like this that happened. It would be at least the second in the last 50 years. 50 years. During the Yugoslavian conflict, when NATO and the United States had determined to break up Yugoslavia into Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Montenegro, there was a little province in between Montenegro and Serbia called Kosovo. And Kosovo had been ethnically and otherwise Serbian for over 1,000 years, since the time of Charlemagne. And the Russians were flat on their back at that time, but when we were staging this war, they managed to send 2 regiments to the Pristina airport in Kosovo in an attempt to keep Kosovo to be part of Serbia. And it angered Bill Clinton personally. And Bill Clinton decided to make Kosovo Kosovo, an independent country. But to do that, he had to do things at the United Nations, make interpretations of international law. He had to form the legal justification. And those are the exact same legal justifications that the Russians used when they retook Crimea from the Ukrainians in 2014. Okay, so if you remember history at all, what we do or what we do not do in Cuba sets a precedent for Taiwan, and I would urge people to think carefully of that. What I think we should do, end the embargo, make sure that they have food and medical supplies and fuel and repair parts for their farm equipment, and then let them either go on muddling along or fail based on their own merits without our involvement. I have absolutely zero confidence that that's what we will do. There's huge Cuban-American populations in the state of Florida and New Jersey. Florida and New Jersey are each large electoral states. Therefore, they become involved in our presidential elections. And as Winston Churchill once quipped, Americans always do the right thing after they've tried everything else first. And I fear that he's correct. I don't like the journalistic similarities, and I would urge caution. To the markets, read the Wall Street Journal this morning, and they said that the markets were down yesterday, Monday, because of fears of the Delta variant of COVID and some other thing. And what a load of horse poo, excuse me. But that was written by some editor. The reason that the market was down yesterday is because the market broke a technical indicator last Friday. All right. And you had the weekend for all the carbon-based traders, that would be humans like you and me, to consider it. And what happened, in essence, is last Friday, which would be, what was last Friday? The 16th or the 20th or something? Today's the 20th. It was the 16th. Yeah, last Friday was the 16th. The market closed down 42.39 points, not a lot, less than a percent, about a percent down. But that broke what's called the 10-day moving average, okay? And when you break a technical indicator like that, it gives you the ability to calculate a probability. And using what's called Bayesian mathematics, the probability that once the market had broken the 10 DMA down, that it was going to go and break the 25 DMA down was better than 2 chances in 3. A quick word about Bayesian calculations, because they're great. Put it in terms of medical things. Suppose you have a virus that infects 1 out of 100 people. And suppose you have a test for the virus that is 95% accurate. Correct result 95% of the time. If you go in and get a test and it says that you're positive for the virus, what's the probability that you actually have the virus? Most people would say 95%, but that's not true. All right, think of it like this. Let's take 100 people at random. In other words, the way we do testing in the United States for COVID, you don't have to have any symptoms. You don't have to show up at a hospital, just random testing. And we test 100 people. Okay, there's one person in that 100 that actually has the virus, so the test is going to identify him or her. But it has a 95% error rate, so it's going to identify 5 other people that do not have the virus. So what's your chance of actually having the virus with a positive test? It's 1 out of 6. You plus the 5 misdiagnosed people. So even with a positive test, the actual chances that you have the virus aren't 95%, they're 9%. Now, if you get 2 tests, that boosts it up to about 90%. And if you get 3 tests, then you can be certain, all from different labs, of course. But anyway, using Bayesian mathematics, which is the way all what we call our algorithmic traders, computerized trading routine, the market broke the 10 DMA down on last Friday. And the probability was very high that it was going to break the 25 DMA down. So it did. But what it did is it sailed right through the 25 DMA down. And the 50-day DMA calculated as of last Friday, DMA means daily moving average, but the 50 DMA as of last Friday was 4,239. And the market traded most of the afternoon at 4,235. It was at or below the 50 DMA. So not only did it crash through the 25, it went all the way down to the 50. In the last 20 minutes of trading, they goosed it to close it at 4,258, which is above the 50-day DMA of 4,239. So they're defending the 50 DMA of 4239. And the reason they're doing that is because if you break the 50 DMA down, using the same mathematical techniques, the probability that you go to the 100 DMA down, which is another 100 points below where we are now, goes from 0.2% to over 20%. 20% is still not huge, but that's a 100-fold increase in the probability if it breaks the 50 DMA down. So they're going to defend the 50 DMA down, but they have a problem. It's earnings season. This week and next, right? And the market is priced for perfection. And if you get a series of bad earnings on any single day, that could, without direct intervention from the powers that be, push the market below this 4,239 level. And then the probability that it goes still lower by at least 100 points increases vastly. So it's touchy right now. And we have to see what happens. Looking at the portfolios, and this is all calculated as of last Friday. Our week goes from Friday to Friday. Last Friday, markets closed at 4,327. Like I said, they were down 0.97%. So if you had $100,000 in a portfolio, you would have expected to lose $970. Our top 30 cap weight, which is the top 30 stocks in the S&P 500 by market weighted by market capitalization, only lost $134, much better than the $970 predicted by the entire market. Top 30 equal weight, which is the same 30 stocks, only equal weighted instead of capitalization weighted, lost $693, still better than $970, but much worse than $130, which shows that the big stocks control. These big stocks are that's what they manage to. They're kind of safe. Those two sectors, because they're the top 30 stocks, have concentration in communication services and internet technology. To eliminate the concentration, we created a third portfolio where we went and got all 11 sectors of the S&P, took the top 3 stocks per sector. That's called the top 3 every sector. That one fell $383, which is still substantially below the $970 that you would have expected. And the large liquid leaders, which is my discretionary portfolio, just on the stocks fell $356, but we totally hedged that portfolio, if you'll recall. And the hedges returned $417 against the $356 that we lost. So we actually made $61 last week in between the effective hedges and the value of the stocks. If we look at the individual stocks involved in the top 30 cap weight, which is the top 30 stocks, 5 of them went up more than $100. And listen to this list. All right. Microsoft, Visa, Apple, Google, and Amazon. All of those stocks are within the top, I think, 7. So 5 of the top largest capitalization stocks were the ones that floated the market last week and kept it from dropping lower than 1%. The 4 losers, in other words, what brought the market down? ExxonMobil, price of oil fell hard last week. Bank America had their earnings, and they reacted a little bit negatively to earnings. Facebook, in the news on reports that it's censoring content based on requests from the administration. Didn't lose that much, 2.6%, but put it on the downside of the ledger. That's the only stock that's missing in the top 5 from the, to make it a complete list. And NVIDIA fell like 9.4% last week. We talked about NVIDIA, how it was becoming a meme stock, and how it went up 45% in between April 9th and week before last. And last week it fell 7.5%. And this week it fell 9.5%. So that's 17% 2 weeks. Still got a long way to go to get back to where it was, and I don't think it will. I think it'll fall another 10, 20% and then stop. But it went up 50% in between April 9th and a couple of weeks ago. The top 30 equal weight, which is the same top 30 stocks, only equal weight them at the top. They only have three stocks above $100 and Visa. And then you had to add MasterCard and Coca-Cola, which had good performances, respectively. MasterCard as a stock was up 3.8%, and Coca-Cola as a stock was up 3.6%. But because they're smaller, they didn't get as much capitalization weight, so they didn't make the other list. The four losers in that portfolio were Facebook, Bank America, Exxon, and NVIDIA, so virtually the same. If we look at the top three by sector, which has the three top stocks in every sector, a little more illuminating. Four stocks won, in other words, four stocks went up above $100, and those would be Visa, and then Duke Energy. Now, Duke Energy is not an energy company, it's a utility, okay? And then NextEra Energy, which is also a utility, and then Coca-Cola. And those stocks were all up above 3.6%. And then you had five losers, and this is interesting. Chevron was down 5.2%. Bank America was down 5.3%. ExxonMobil was down 6.4%. Boeing was down 9.1%. And ConocoPhillips was down 7.7%. And remember, this portfolio is comprised of the three top stocks in each sector, and it contains all three stocks from the energy sector: Chevron, Exxon, and Conoco. Those are your top three, and they were all down more than 5%. Price of oil went down about 10% last week. Large liquid leaders, which is my discretionary portfolio, three stocks gained above $100: Vista, Procter & Gamble, and Honeywell. Four stocks lost more than $100: JP Morgan, Facebook, Kinder Morgan, and ExxonMobil. But remember, it's hedged. If you look at that, ExxonMobil as a stock subtracted $293 from the portfolio, which is almost the entire loss. It was only $360. But hedges made up $251 of that. Kinder Morgan, which is also an energy company, but it's more in the pipeline business, would have subtracted $260 from the portfolio, but because of the hedges, we made up $225 of that on the hedges. On the other side, Visa would have added $183 to the portfolio, but the hedges cut that back by $120, right? Procter & Gamble would have added $110, but the hedges cut that back by $40, and so on. But on balance, we made $60 more than we lost on hedges. If you take all five portfolios together and there's 54 stock or four portfolios. If you take all four and there's 54 stocks and then you just rank them for the last week, we had five stocks that were up more than 3%. And that would be Duke Energy, which was up 4.1%, Visa, which was up 4.1%, NextEra Energy up 3.9%, MasterCard up 3.8%, and Coca-Cola up 3.6%. There were four stocks that were up more than 2% but less than 3%, 8 stocks that were up more than 1% but less than 2%, 8 more stocks that were up more than 0 but less than 1, 12 stocks that were down more than 0 but less than 1%, 6 stocks that were down in between 1 and 2%, 4 stocks that were down in between 2 and 3%, no stocks that were down in between 3 and 5%, not a 1, and then 7 stocks that were down more than 5%. And those 7 stocks were ConocoPhillips, Bank America, Kinder Morgan, and those are all 5.5, 5.3%. ExxonMobil fell 6.4%. ConocoPhillips fell 7. CVX is Chevron, one of the ones that fell 5.2%. ConocoPhillips was 7.7% down. Bank America on their earnings fell 9.1%, and NVIDIA, which we talked about, meme stock, fell 9.4%. Today and tomorrow are going to be interesting. Recall what I said. We broke the 10 DMA down on Friday. The market sailed right through the 25 DMA, bounced off the 50 DMA. They closed Monday at 4,258. The 50 DMA is 4,239. It doesn't make a huge difference. They'll either hold this level and then start moving up from here, or they'll drop to about 4,100 and start, unless something bad happens, like earnings or just a total, negative blowout. I don't expect that, but it could happen. And then you might have the 200 DMA in play, which is all the way down at 3,900. But that's a very low probability event. But they have to defend 42.39. You have earnings all this week, but the big earnings, all the tech companies, Apple and Facebook and Microsoft, and those people are predominantly next week. Going to be interesting to see what happens. I'm going to maintain the hedges on my position through this period, and then we'll see where we are after earnings. And that's about it. Questions, comments, or to inform me what a shout-out is, email Paul at StockBettor. That's Paul at StockBettor, BETTOR.com. Name of the show is The Bogdanich Perspective. You can find us here on TalkCast PDX, TalkCastPDX.com. That's the most reliable way. It's scattered around the web everywhere, Spotify, YouTube, blah, 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 under The Bogdanich Perspective. But thank you for watching on this Tuesday. And join me next Tuesday. Let's see what happens to this market. Do they defend the 50 DMA at 4,239? Going to be interesting. Do widzenia. That means goodbye.